Hey guys, Pixel here. I've owned the Fujifilm X-T200 for 3 months now, and I'm ready to give you guys my final opinions on this camera. The way that I'm approaching this video is different to other YouTubers, however. I want to give my own unique perspective on this camera after being a prior owner of the Fujifilm X-A10 for 2 years, one of the cheapest interchangeable lens cameras that Fujifilm has ever produced. Basically meaning, my opinions on the X-T200 are based on shooting with budget kit as opposed to expensive kit, and working with what some may see as compromises. So in this video, I want to show you all the things that make the X-T200 a great camera. Let's get into it. What shocked me when I first got the camera out of the box is just how small and light it is. The lens is tiny too, smaller than on my previous camera, thanks to it being motorized and hiding away when turned off. This is why I love mirrorless cameras and find using DSLRs, especially full frames, to be a massive chore. The T200 fits anywhere, in a small messenger bag, in a backpack, and even my coat pocket, and you don't feel like it's there because of the light weight. Since I made the point to bring up the lens, while I'm a fan of its size, I am not a fan of its motor control. I find it to be too fast or too slow, but mostly the former. I'll want to crop in just a tiny bit, but the lens will zoom to the halfway point and then I have to go back and readjust. You can however use the focus dial as a slow zoom, which mostly fixes this issue. And because there is no text or diagram to tell you which direction to turn the lens, I never know which way to twist. I'm an overall fan of the design of T200, both in terms of its looks and usability. As with most Fuji cameras, the camera looks like an old SLR, which either gives you cool points or makes you look unprofessional, depending on who you ask. The camera has 3 manual dials on the top. The one on the left can be customized, but by default it switches between film simulation modes. The one in the shutter button is the shutter speed, or the aperture, in shutter priority or aperture priority respectively. The dial to the right of these modes is exposure compensation. In manual, this becomes the shutter speed dial. While this is a big upgrade from my previous camera, which had this cheap dial that was easy to accidentally move, it is a little too tricky to move, especially when moving your finger to the right. You win some, you lose some, I suppose. On the back of the camera, we have 4 main buttons: burst mode, playback mode, and 2 blank buttons. Mine is set to Q mode on the left and AF lock to the right, which I believe at default. Having the AF lock button is so nice. Even my Fuji Bridge camera had this button, so I don't know why this was omitted in the A10. Then, we have a really nice feeling joystick with a center click, menu/OK button, and display/back button. Overall, easy to get used to. I don't hate the lack of buttons, but I do think certain things aren't very easy to access, like for example ISO control. That's something I wish was a dedicated button. The screen tilts and flips in any way that you'd ever want it to. You can even hide the screen so it doesn't get scratched up, and also not chimp. The screen is really soft however. I have managed to scratch it up with my fingernail, and now I have ugly scratches on a brand new camera. Well, I ordered some screen protectors to make sure that never happens again. On the left side of the camera is a 3.5mm input jack for a microphone or a remote, and with an included headphone dongle, you can use the USB-C port for headphones out too. A problem I had with the X-A10 was the lack of a hot shoe. This has it. Fujifilm has also solved the problem where cameras like the X-A20, which did have a hot shoe, had a flip-up screen which would be blocked by a flash, video light, or your microphone. This is a problem that the S6100 from Sony suffers from, so it's nice to know that this isn't a problem here. And generally, I like how this type of screen gives you more options for movement. This camera has so many features that I spent a few hours just learning the menus and seeing what new there is. The touchscreen gives you new abilities like touching to focus or touching to shoot. As someone who's never used a D-pad to choose an AF point, tapping to focus the screen doesn't require any memorizing, it's instantly easy to get used to. The screen also features pinch to zoom and double tap to zoom like on a phone, and it is almost as responsive as a phone, although the zooming is a bit linear, as in you pinch your fingers and swipe even a little bit, it will continue to keep zooming and zooming into the image, like your fingers are a switch. The UI also flips depending on the screen's orientation, which is great. Also, you have the ability to display an electronic level. Again, this is something that my Bridge camera had but not the A10, so I'm glad that it's here. Straining images is the worst, most tedious part of post-production. The screen on the T200 is stupidly sharp. It makes looking back at your images really nice, especially since it is so big comparatively. The X-A10 screen wasn't bad at all, but this is on another level. The screen has 2.76 million dots. You have a My Menu button, which is standard on most cameras now. I'm not used to this, but it is great that it is here. This paired with the Q menu, the touchscreen menu, and the 2 blank buttons means that you have 4 different ways to access the same functions, so make sure you have it all set in a way that you'll remember what is where. This sounds like the most newbie advice, but seriously, if you buy a camera, either go through its menus in thorough detail or read its manual. As embarrassed as I am to say this, I still have kept learning about my A10 until the day I sold it. Before I talk about some other things about this camera, let's talk image quality. As you'd expect, The T200 takes some fantastic looking photos. It's difficult for me to review the image quality since I don't really know what to say other than the pictures look fantastic. Even the A10 did a good job of photos, and I think that's the smallest improvement between the two cameras. Other than sharpness, which has improved significantly here, I'm not sure how much of this is down to the lens and how much is down to the higher resolution. I think the sharpness is down to the lens, and being able to crop in further and less grain is due to the higher megapixel count. The photographs are high in size too, sometimes easily hitting over 10 megabytes in size. While the images are sharper, there's an unfortunate problem with this lens, and it is that it's not as sharp on the top right and bottom right corners. Whether I turn stabilization on or off, it still looks bad. I do look at the reviews to see if I have a faulty unit, but no, I found multiple people who state that the lens is exceptionally sharp in the middle, but not sharp in the corners. And because of this, I feel like the lens is a downgrade to what I've already owned. Or at least a compromise, having a better sharpness in the middle but far worse sharpness in the corners. Oh well, I suppose. I'll want to in the future buy more lenses for this camera, so it's not the end of the world. Also, here are the original photos that came out of the camera and my own edits. The in-camera processing by itself is usually fine, but I prefer to shoot in RAW and tweak things myself to make the images look the way I want them to. And it's difficult to get the most dynamic range out of a JPEG too. For most sets of photos I've used classic chrome. I really do think that the pictures speak for themselves in terms of the camera's quality. The lens has a closer minimum focus distance to objects than the A10's lens. It doesn't focus close enough for me to be able to use it as a dedicated macro lens, but for a kit lens it is fantastic. The bokeh is just as good as you'd expect as well. Image stabilization is very good, as to be expected from Fujifilm. If you have a steady hand, you're able to shoot between 1/4 and 1/15 of a second, thanks to the stabilization in the lens. The camera can easily shoot handheld at any lighting situation. There are very high ISO options that you can choose if you're shooting in JPEG. They're very noisy, they're very much edging on unusable, but this does allow you to shoot in a very dark environment handheld. In terms of video, this camera can shoot 1080p 60, 1080p 30 with HDR, and 1080p 120fps, as well as 4K 30fps. There is no proper 4K, and in fact, the camera downsamples from 6K to make the footage even sharper, and the footage looks fantastic in 4K. In 1080p 60, the footage can look a little off. The footage is over-sharpened and noisy and a little jagged. Very unnoticeable under YouTube's heavy compression, but yeah, in 4K I have zero problems with the video quality. If you guys want to see more video examples, there are Pocket Pixel videos shot partially or entirely with the T200. It's a massive change from my A10, which had an unusably noisy microphone, and the footage also was very aliased and blurry, but like 5 times worse than the T200. Speaking of the microphone, now I'm going to do something deeply shameful and do a vlog style video, just to show you guys what the quality looks like when you're walking around and you're talking to the microphone. I feel like an idiot. I don't know how people can do this, but I'm actually quite a fan of how the video looks right now. This is actually the second take of the video that I shot, because as you can see, the first video did not focus on my face, despite the AF box being on my face. Alright, I haven't touched on the extra modes yet. The HDR mode just plans the overall image down as you expect, reducing contrast and highlights. I can see myself using this occasionally when I'm in an environment that goes for it, but otherwise I'll leave it off. There is the gimbal mode, which I was excited for, until I actually saw the footage. It's like it's ran through a bad warp stabilizer, it's terrible. You might as well just run the 4K footage for a stabilizer in post at that point. Also, I haven't brought up the fact that I cannot get lens stabilization to work in video mode. I have no idea why, it's definitely enabled for photos. If anyone can help me out here, please let me know in the comments down below on how to turn on lens stabilization in video. Also, it took between 20 to 25 minutes for the yellow temperature light to come on for me, shooting in 1080p 60fps. Finally, the T200 also has a webcam mode, which Fuji couldn't have released at a better time. This feature was likely created for streamers, but hey, now your new camera can also make you look nice on your Zoom call. The biggest reason I wanted to move away from my previous camera was the lack of AF options. You had the option of manual, multi, area, continuous, and track in focus modes. With the T200, you have manual, continuous, and single focus modes, and single point, zone, wide/tracking, and all autofocus modes. With how slow the A10 was to focus and how inaccurate the autofocus was, it made shooting anything but static shots a pain. The T200 actually detects what's in the scene and focuses onto it, instead of just shooting in the middle like the A10. The A10's tracking was absolutely dreadful, the camera constantly hunting. Here, however, it's perfectly fine. Focusing in general on this camera is decent, and it is generally fast as well. It's not as fast as a DSLR, but it is more than usable. I don't really have much else to say. I haven't had any major problems with focusing. A problem I had with the X-A10 was the fact that in burst mode, the camera would not readjust focus. Unless your subject is staying in the same distance, that's fine, but as soon as someone starts moving, forget about them being in focus. Thankfully, I do not have this problem with the T200. Furthermore, there is also eye and face detection. Unfortunately, a problem that I have has not been fixed. The buffer is small and the reload time is extremely slow, dare I say even slower than the A10 due to the high resolution pictures. Unfortunately, even this camera's closest competitor from Canon, the 77D, suffers from a small buffer. I think having a good buffer requires spending over $1,000 on a body, unfortunately. Even though this is sacrilegious, if I was to take shots of fast moving subjects, which I can do now, I would just do in JPEG. With the A10, getting exposure right on the screen was difficult. In bright lighting, I would end up overexposing my images because on screen they look right. Having an EVF solves this issue for the most part. The EVF is nice to use. It's not as easy to nail focus with as with an optical viewfinder, but you do have nice things on display that you wouldn't have otherwise, like focus peaking, electronic level, etc. Of course, when you're in a tricky situation like shooting backlit, you can use AE bracketing, which has a lot of options in this camera. You can choose how many stops of exposure you want, as well as how many shots you want. There's also HDR bracketing, but this creates a JPEG that is very flat. Just better to do it yourself in Lightroom, I think. I think Fuji has improved film simulations on this camera too, as they look different and subjectively nicer on the T200. More subdued maybe, not as over the top. While we don't have Eterna and Classic Neg, we do have High Pro Neg and Standard Pro Neg. Rest in peace, Pro 400H, we'll miss you. But yeah, the idea of Pro Neg is the same as with the Pro film. It's good for portraits and weddings, and it's actually quite good for landscapes too. Well, the film simulation is. I haven't had the chance to use the Pro 400 yet. You can create your own film look by changing the color, sharpness, contrast and white balance functions directly in the camera. You can check out the Fuji X Weekly app or website to learn about the different custom film simulations that you can apply to your own camera. It's a lot of fun, although a lot of them look very similar on my camera. The Fuji camera app is just as glitchy as ever, making me have to close it and reopen it just to get the camera to connect. Bluetooth works great, sharing location and being able to use it as a remote shutter works great, but the Wi-Fi is really slow, much slower than on the A10, and it makes live view just really terrible to use, especially since the camera is prone to disconnecting literally 3 feet away from you. Why, Fuji? I am genuinely disappointed since I rely on live view for self-portraits. Well, not anymore, I suppose. The last important thing for me to mention are the bugs. Yeah, this camera has a lot of bugs. I have had this camera multiple times save my photos and videos in a DCIM folder instead of the XXX_Fuji folder, and since my camera doesn't check the DCIM folder for files, in the camera's gallery, my pictures weren't there. This is ridiculous, and I don't even know how this can occur, but it makes it look like you forgot to hit record when shooting video, or that your memory card corrupted, when instead, your photos and videos are just in a different folder. I've also had the camera lock up on me once, ironically when using AF lock, and I've also had the camera randomly restart on me in the middle of shooting a video. I also have had the webcam mode stop working for me as soon as I was going to use it in a Teams call. I don't know if it was the laptop, the cable, or the camera's fault, but yeah, that was annoying. Fuji really needs to get their act together with this firmware. There's a ridiculous amount of bugs, and I'm on the latest firmware as of early March. Oh yeah, also the battery life. The A10 had a fantastic battery. I basically never had to charge it on holidays. With the T200, due to the juice sipping internals and the screen, the battery is dreadful. Okay, so I have gone out and did a big shoot. I left the house at 9:30 and currently it is 12:30. I'm on 1 bar currently. I've fully filled my SD card. I should stop shooting RAW and JPEG because I've just thrown away the JPEG, so I should just shoot RAW because then I have more space. Anyway, filled my 16 gig card, put another one in just now, and I'm still on 1 bar. So the battery has lasted me just about. Also, the exposure is really blowing me out. For some reason, it's also not tracking my face whatsoever. Oh, and now it is. So it turns out, oh look at that, the exposure is so much better. So as it turns out, you have to flip the screen fully for it to track your face. If I tilt the screen just slightly up, like I have done now, the screen flips for me and it no longer tracks my face, therefore it's not exposing for my face. I think a lot of YouTubers have not done this camera justice. I've heard this camera be referred to as a budget option, a good first camera to learn photography with, or entry level. And to me personally, those things don't sound like compliments, and instead they make the camera sound not as good as it actually is. I think what camera you should buy depends on what you'll need it for. I've seen a great video, and I hope I can find it, that says what camera you buy totally depends on what style of photography you shoot. For example, this camera would be absolutely useless for sports photography or potentially like wildlife photography where there's like animals like running around trying to eat each other because of the buffer. You don't want to take like 15 pictures and then have to wait up to 30-40 seconds for the buffer to reload. That would be useless. But for something like landscapes, this camera is great. For something like product photography, you know, for portraits, this camera's great, you know. I mean, I do self-portraits, which isn't the same, but it's great for self-portraits because of the eye and face AF. Now, this camera might not work for some other people, but straight up calling it a beginner's camera just feels very disingenuous. A beginner's camera to me is something like the Fujifilm X-T200, because that's very cheap and very easy to get used to. Or if you want to talk about Canon, the Canon 3000D. It's not a great camera, it's actually pretty bad, but you don't care as a beginner, you just want something to learn how to do photography with. Learning to do photography on an £800 camera, that's a really expensive camera to buy as a first camera. You know, I am not a professional. I don't do photography professionally. I also don't get paid off of YouTube. I don't see myself as a professional, but I'm using this camera for all of my YouTube videos and I'm so happy with it, and I'm using it for my university stuff and I'm, again, very happy with it. This camera, minus the firmware bugs, has not let me down. It's, for me personally, I think it's a fantastic camera, and the fact that I managed to buy it for £480 on a Christmas discount, you're not going to buy a better camera for that price. In fact, I think this is probably one of the best cameras you can buy under £1,000. Because looking at the competitors, well, they all offer the same advantages and disadvantages, or even more disadvantages. So for me personally, I think the X-T200 is a fantastic camera. Whether this is a fantastic camera to you, well, that just depends on what you need it for. I think I'm going to end up keeping this camera for many years to come, because even if I end up buying myself a full-frame DSLR if I need one, well, this is still a great travel camera, at least. You know, it's light, it's portable, and it takes fantastic looking pictures and it takes fantastic looking videos. So I'm very happy with this camera. Anyway, this is a very long conclusion. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.